Welcome to the Deep Dive.
Hey there.
Today, we are exploring something really timeless. How do you actually raise up and release the next generation of leaders?
Yeah, and we're digging into some, well, remarkably ancient texts to do it. Our main source today is a guide that pulls wisdom straight from the Bible, the letters to Titus, 1 and Timothy, and Hebrews.
Right. So our mission for this deep dive is to unpack the lessons these sources offer, about finding, training, empowering new leaders.
And the big question for you listening has got to be, what does this ancient wisdom mean for us today?
Let's unpack this.
Okay, let's kick off with Titus. The source paints him as a fascinating figure right from the get-go.
Yeah, likely a convert from Paul's first big missionary journey. A Greek, a Gentile.
And what's really striking about Titus, and the source brings this out, is how his very identity kind of underscored the whole gospel message.
How so?
Well, being an uncircumcised Greek, his presence with Paul back at that Jerusalem council, maybe around 49 A.D., it just dramatically showed the freedom the gospel brought to Gentiles.
Ugh, like a walking billboard for Paul's message about the freedom we have in Christ Jesus.
Exactly. It's interesting. He's not actually mentioned in the book of Acts.
Oh, really?
Yeah, but he pops up 13 times in Paul's letters.
So clearly someone Paul came to rely on heavily. The source calls his background a curriculum vitae, showing he was capable, devoted, resourceful.
Definitely. Paul even called him my partner and fellow worker and my true son. High praise.
And Paul didn't exactly give him the easy jobs, did he?
Not at all. He sent Titus into some really tough spots, like dealing with those divisions in the church at Corinth.
Right, that was a mess.
Yeah, and the source points out that Titus handled it brilliantly. He reported back happy, refreshed, got a positive outcome. He even managed to organize a collection there, too.
So a real problem solver, someone who could handle complexity and get results.
Precisely. And then, after Paul's first imprisonment, Titus gets maybe his most daunting task.
Which was?
Being left on the island of Crete. His job. To straighten out what was left unfinished and appoint elders in every town.
Wow. And Crete. Well, it had quite the reputation back then, didn't it?
Oh, yeah. The source mentions Cretans were known for lying, laziness, rebellion, deception, generally difficult people.
Okay, so not exactly fertile ground for planting stable churches.
Not exactly. And that context is key, right?
Yep.
It totally shapes the kind of instructions Paul gives them. It wasn't just appoint elders.
It was appoint elders with the right character in a place like Crete.
Exactly. And it meant Titus had to directly confront that ingrained culture of dishonesty and rebellion within the churches.
Paul also really hammered home teaching in accord with sound doctrine.
He did. And the source makes a great point here. This wasn't just like abstract theological stuff.
Right, it was practical.
Totally practical. Instruction for older people, young adults, everyone, showing integrity, seriousness, and soundness of speech that cannot be condemned. Pretty smart advice, really.
Still relevant advice today, I'd say.
Absolutely. And part of Titus's job, his authority, came from knowing what to teach, but also how to live it out. Paul told him, encourage, rebuke when necessary.
But always remember the grace.
Always remember the grace God showed everyone. That grace should make the teaching about God attractive, even to people in really tough social spots, like believing slaves.
And cut through the noise, too, right? Paul told him to avoid all those foolish controversies and divisive people.
Yeah, focus on the core message. Contrast all that stuff with the reality that salvation is purely by God's mercy, not because of anything we did.
A good reminder, we were all foolish, disobedient, deceived before that mercy.
Exactly. And Paul's practical side comes through again. He tells Titus to make sure the believers devoted themselves to doing good, living productive lives, meeting daily needs.
So Titus gets this heavy-duty assignment, bring order, establish leadership in a really challenging place.
Yeah, equipped with this very specific guidance. He wasn't there forever, though. Eventually, he gets sent off to Dalmatia.
After visiting Paul again, right?
That's right. And the source notes he's still honored on Crete today, which is quite something.
Okay, so that's Titus. Now let's shift to Timothy. A different story, but maybe similar principles.
Yeah, I think so. Timothy comes onto the scene just after that Jerusalem council we mentioned. He joins Paul and Silas on their second big journey.
And he was young, right? Like really young.
Just a teenager, probably. From Lystra, kind of a rural town where Paul had actually been badly beaten up on his previous trip.
Wow. Talk about stepping into a challenging situation right alongside your mentor from day one.
For sure. And Timothy had this mixed background, too. Jewish mom, Greek dad.
And the source highlights his willingness to undergo circumcision.
Yes, even though he was already a believer, specifically so he could minister more effectively among Jewish communities. That shows incredible dedication for a teenager.
It really does. And even then, he apparently already had a good reputation as a disciple in his hometown and nearby.
So he spends years traveling with Paul. It's basically this long, intense internship.
He saw it all firsthand.
Everything. The beatings, the imprisonments, the arrests, the trials, that terrifying sea journey to Rome.
Man. So by the time Paul's writing these letters to him, probably from a Roman dungeon during his second imprisonment,
Timothy's maybe around 30 years old, and Paul uses that same affectionate term for him, my true son. Shows that deep bond.
and just like Titus, Timothy's CV was packed with experiences that prepared him for major leadership.
Totally. The source listed out, witnessing mob attacks, enduring the sheer hardship of constant travel, seeing Paul's faith, his prayers, visions,
Learning how to make disciples, plant churches in different settings.
facing abuse alongside Paul and Silas in Philippi, developing resilience, teaming up with Silas to support new churches, being trusted with more and more responsibility.
Reporting back to Paul, supporting him, helping plant that major mission hub in Ephesus.
Yeah, and being sent back to places like Macedonia and even Corinth to sort out problems.
So by the time Paul leaves him in charge in Ephesus, Timothy's really been through the fire.
He has. And Ephesus was a major city, a huge responsibility with its own set of serious challenges.
And Paul urged him to stay, right? Knowing it was tough.
Yes, he knew Timothy might feel overwhelmed. So the letters, 1 and 2 Timothy, are packed with Paul's instructions for leading in that complex environment.
And a big focus seems to be guarding against false doctrines.
Absolutely. Those endless myths and genealogies, the controversies that just distracted people from, as Paul puts it, God's work.
And Paul grounds him again, doesn't he? Telling him the core motivation has to be love that comes from a pure heart and a good conscience and a sincere faith.
Yes, and holding tightly to sound doctrine that fits with the glorious gospel.
You can really feel the urgency in Paul's writing, can't you? The source mentions him telling Timothy to hold on to faith and a good conscience like sailors fighting off a shipwreck.
Yeah, because apparently some had already shipwrecked their faith. It wasn't just theoretical danger.
And Paul reminds him about his spiritual gift, too. Don't neglect it, fan it into flame.
Right, which implies it could easily flicker out if he wasn't intentional.
And encouragement, too. Rely on a spirit of power, love, and self-discipline, not timidity or fear.
Crucially, Paul tells him, don't be ashamed. Not ashamed of the message, not ashamed of Paul, his mentor, who's now a prisoner.
Instead, join in the suffering.
Join in suffering for the gospel, relying on God's power. And remember the big picture. The grace given before time began, revealed through Jesus, who destroyed death. Powerful stuff.
So, looking at both Titus and Timothy, what really jumps out, and the source really emphasizes this,
Is that Paul didn't shield them.
exactly. He didn't protect them from the harsh realities or the difficult assignments.
No, he equipped them through those things.
Didn't.
Through shared experience, through that close mentorship, through direct instruction. But then he trusted them.
He released them with significant, often really tough responsibilities, even when they were relatively young.
Yeah. Okay, let's briefly touch on the letter to the Hebrews. It's a bit different.
How so?
Well, unlike the letters to Timothy and Titus, the source points out Hebrews is anonymous. No clear author intro, no specific date or place, no named recipients given right there in the text.
Which has led to a lot of debate over the centuries about who wrote it.
Right. People have suggested Luke, Clement, Apollos, Barnabas, even Priscilla and Aquila. Pauline authorship had early support, especially in the East, and became widely accepted later on.
But the authorship debate isn't really our focus here. What is relevant?
Is the internal evidence.
Yeah.
It strongly suggests it was written to a group of believers, probably Jewish Christians, who were under immense pressure.
Pressure to do what?
To give up, to lapse back into Judaism, perhaps while the temple in Jerusalem was still standing.
Okay, so a context of potential burnout, maybe persecution, disillusionment.
Exactly. Maybe written, as the source suggests, not long before that big persecution broke out in Rome under Nero in AD 64. If Paul did write it, it might have been around the same time he was writing to Timothy from prison.
Got it. So the critical connection the source is making here
Is that the issues faced by Titus in Crete, Timothy in Ephesus, and the recipients of Hebrews, well, they sound remarkably similar to challenges leaders and believers face today.
right. And notice both Timothy and Titus were already known disciples, already making disciples before Paul tapped them for these huge leadership roles.
That's a key point. They weren't novices pulled out of nowhere. They were already active.
And they were equipped through participating in really tough pioneering assignments, planting churches, making disciples.
And then they were released with major responsibility in the very churches and regions they helped start.
Yeah, the source makes a contrast there. They weren't burdened with navigating the internal politics of, say, the long-established church back in Jerusalem.
That feels like a really significant distinction, doesn't it?
It does. And the source basically argues that young adults today are also called to this kind of pioneering, almost apostolic leadership for mission.
The opportunities are huge, but yeah, the task is daunting. It's definitely not a walk in the park.
So the source identifies these core themes, like 9 of them, running through these letters, kind of a blueprint for equipping and releasing.
Yeah, let's maybe touch on a few of the big ones that really shaped Titus and Timothy. First, the gospel frame. Meaning the gospel wasn't just a teaching, it was the fundamental rule for their life and their mission. Paul constantly reminded them of their salvation call, their responsibility to share that grace. It was the lens for everything.
Okay, foundational. What's next?
Second, prayer and worship. Sounds obvious, maybe, but Paul didn't just tell them to pray. He showed them. He told them he prayed for them. He urged them to intercede for others. It was vital.
Right.
Third, and this is absolutely critical according to the source, disciples make disciples. This was like the DNA of the early church movement.
So not just learning, but immediately doing.
Exactly. The source notes that pretty much every new disciple we read about in the New Testament immediately starts participating in making other disciples and planting churches.
Which means the next generation wasn't just sitting on the sidelines being taught.
No, they were on the cutting edge, actively engaged in the core mission right from the start.
Okay, 4th theme.
Sound doctrine and balanced instruction. Paul clearly had confidence in Timothy, even though he's young, and maybe others look down on him.
Yeah, you quoted that passage earlier. Don't let anyone look down on you because you're young. Set an example.
Devote yourself to the public reading of Scripture, to preaching and to teaching. Do not neglect your gift. Be diligent. Watch your life and doctrine closely.
That's pretty intense, but clear guidance.
Very. And it connects directly to the 5th theme, know your spiritual gifts.
Paul explicitly reminded Timothy about his gift, right?
He did. The source uses that modern acronym, SHAPE, spiritual gifts, heart passions, abilities, personality, experiences. That's a helpful way to think about it. Know your strengths, know your limits, and actually use what God has given you. Don't neglect it.
Makes sense. What's 6th?
6th is faithful resilience. This is huge. It's where Timothy's tough experiences and the whole message of Hebrews really come together.
Paul's own life was the prime example.
Absolutely. He urged Timothy, and implicitly all believers under pressure through Hebrews, essentially. Be faithful. Treasure the Holy Spirit. Guard your gifts. Commit to your calling. Read the Scriptures. Hold on to sound doctrine. Teach the Word.
And the core message from Hebrews being,
look to Jesus and don't give up. It's this comprehensive appeal for persistence, even when you're facing doubt, suffering, maybe even institutional pushback or abuse. Keep the end vision alive.
Powerful. Okay, 7th.
7th, the source talks about functional and sacrificial leadership frames, meaning Paul wasn't pushing some static, rigid organizational chart.
It was about what worked.
What worked to advance the gospel? That's functionality. And leadership that reflected the self-giving, sacrificial attitude of Jesus, its cruciformity. It had to be both.
Got it. 8th theme. This one sounds interesting. Keychain leadership.
Yeah. This term apparently comes from some modern research on churches trying to engage younger generations, ones that are growing young. The source adapts it, saying Paul was acutely aware of the need to pass on the keys, authority, responsibility, resources. And he was intentional about entrusting keys to all generations.
But there's a twist, right? The source makes a distinction.
A crucial one. While the growing young idea often focuses on handing over keys within existing church structures, Paul was doing something different with Titus and Timothy.
He was equipping them to take
full responsibility for entire districts, whole regions, where they had already been multiplying disciples and churches through their own work.
Ah, okay. Not just a role in the established thing, but leadership of the new thing they helped create.
Precisely. And that flows right into the 9th, and maybe the most challenging theme for us today. Full responsibility for mission and churches in districts.
What's the core argument here?
The source argues Paul's ultimate vision was actually much bigger than just making existing churches feel younger or more relevant.
It was about
Equipping and releasing young adults to literally leave the shelter of established structures and be the church in new places, taking total responsibility.
Total responsibility for everything.
Disciple making, planting new churches, leading them, equipping others, teaching, baptizing, multiplying, the whole works, so that ultimately there would be no place left untouched by the gospel.
Wow. That contrast is really sharp when you put it like that. Growing young inside versus leaving to be church outside.
It is stark, isn't it? And the source argues pretty strongly that holding capable young adults back from that kind of full pioneering responsibility, well, it often leads to frustration, disillusionment. They feel stifled.
Whereas
When they're equipped, trusted, and fully released to take that total responsibility, starting new things, leading new work, making disciples who make disciples, planting churches that plant churches.
that's when you see real growth.
That's when the source observes real growth happens. Maturity in faith, in life, in doctrine. You see zeal, creativity, multiplication.
And the source mentions seeing this happen.
Yeah, it points to observational examples from different parts of the world today. Europe, Australia, Africa, the Middle East, Asia, the Pacific, where intentionally releasing the next generations to leave to be church seems to be bearing significant fruit.
Wow, okay, that really was a deep dive. Some incredibly practical, but also pretty challenging insights there from Titus, Timothy, and Hebrews about empowering the next generation.
Yeah, we've looked at these profiles of leaders who were, frankly, thrown into the deep end, but equipped along the way, and those core principles that shape their development and their mission.
And we've definitely wrestled with that contrast. The source highlighted that difference between focusing on growing young within existing structures versus fully releasing the next generation to leave to be church with total responsibility for new mission fields.
So as you've been listening, what stands out to you from all this? What resonates or maybe challenges you?
Yeah, and here's maybe a final thought for you to mull over. The source really concludes that Paul's vision was fundamentally about equipping and releasing young adults to take total responsibility for multiplying churches and movements in entirely new districts, literally leaving to be church outside the existing walls.
So the question becomes, what would it actually look like, practically speaking, to put that kind of vision into practice today in our context?
And maybe even more pointedly, how might embracing that kind of vision challenge some of the more, let's say, conventional approaches to leadership development and mission that you might be familiar with or involved in? Something to think about.